All right, Cheyenne. So here I'm really focused on grammar and style. And by style, I mean, could you have said something in a smoother or more effective way? I'm not really interested right now in how strong the ideas are. I'm just really focused on these two things, grammar and style. So we see that the Reconstruction era, and right here we need a capital R and a capital E, because that's not just any era in history, it's a specific era, the Reconstruction era. So that's a proper noun, meaning it should be capitalized. So a really easy way to check that kind of thing is just to type it into the Google search bar and find anybody that has written about, for example, the Reconstruction era, and just see if it's capitalized or not. Similarly, on Civil War, that also needs to be capitalized. Again, it was a specific war, so it's a proper noun. And so the Reconstruction era began in 1865 when the Civil War ended and continued on. So there's nothing grammatically wrong about this part, continued on, but this is a thing of style. Anytime we can cut words out that aren't absolutely necessary, it's a good idea. If something is continuing, it implies that it continues on, so we can get rid of that. Continued until the year 1877, bringing great social, political, and economic changes to American society. The effects of these changes continued well past the conflict. For example, the passage, I'm going to put a comma right there. For example, the passage of the 13th, 14th, you can see there needs to be a space right there after the comma before you write 14th. For example, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So here we have 3 items in a list, and whenever we do that, we need to have a comma after the first 2 items. So 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments brought forth great social changes for African Americans. The political changes included the assassination of President Lincoln and the Reconstruction plans for the nation under the elevation of Andrew Johnson to the presidency, followed by the election of Ulysses S. We need a period there. Ulysses S. Grant in 1868. The political changes included the assassination of President Lincoln and the Reconstruction plans for the nation under the elevation of Andrew Johnson to the presidency, followed by the election of Ulysses S. Grant. A long sentence, and we're sticking with grammar right now, so I don't want to deal with that one just yet. But it's a long sentence, it's a bit of a mouthful, and it's kind of confusing. So we'll come back to that one. There were also great changes in economics during the Reconstruction period. So I would say great economic changes, because it's not quite clear what you mean by great changes in economics. But if you just use economic as an adjective describing the changes, I think that's the clearest way to do that. During the Reconstruction period, and again, we need a capital here. After the Civil War, the Southern economy was destroyed. Cities, plantations, roads, comma. Remember, in a list, we need a comma after each of the items in the list, 1, 2, 3, except for that last item. Cities, plantations, roads, and bridges had been burned. The need for resources and labor to rebuild the South contributed to the need for expedited industrial growth. So let's look at this group of words here. Cities, plantations, roads, and bridges had been burned. That's a complete sentence right there. You have a subject, which is a multiple subject, all these things, cities, plantations, roads. And then you also have a predicate. They tell us something about the subject, which is that these things had been burned. It's complete. So then you used a comma right here. And then you have another group of words that's also complete. The need for resources and labor to rebuild the South. The need is your subject. And then you have a predicate. It contributed to the need for expedited industrial growth. So anytime you have a group of words that's complete and another group of words that's complete, you cannot join them with a comma. We need to either make that a semicolon or we need to make it a period and make it into two sentences. If we want to use a comma, we can use a comma, but we also have to have a conjunction word in there too. For example, cities, plantations, roads, and bridges had been burned, comma, and the need for resources and labor to rebuild the South. Blah, blah, blah. So I'm thinking that it may have been confusing because I was using the same color for both grammar issues and style issues in the previous videos. So I'm just going to distinguish those by indicating grammar errors with red and indicating style errors with blue. So we read, Reconstruction was already underway when President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. The Reconstruction plans were designed to once again unite the country. That's all fine. The problem is that, so this sentence right here starts with Reconstruction, but it finishes with President Lincoln being assassinated. So because it finishes with that fact, I expect the next sentence to have to do with President Lincoln being assassinated. Instead, it goes back to Reconstruction plans, and it's kind of confusing. So that's not a grammar issue. It's not a black and white grammar mistake, but it's a style error because I think you could have said things in a clearer way. So this is all about President Lincoln. And then it's sort of strange how that connects straight to the Reconstruction plans. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. So again, the point with that is just that it's always a good idea to have your sentences link one to the next really smoothly. So if you're going to finish this sentence talking about Lincoln, you ought to start the next sentence having to do with Lincoln. If you want to start this sentence with Reconstruction plans now, it might be a better idea to change this sentence up here and put the fact of President Lincoln being assassinated in front over here. And then you can follow that up with the bit about Reconstruction. And then that will smoothly flow from this part to this part. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was primarily to unite the nation as quickly as possible and to restore. We've used this word unite twice, so let's maybe try something else. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was primarily to. Actually, I think one thing we could do here is you used once again unite. Maybe we could put that all into one word, just reunite. And that would kill two birds with one stone because you would be saying this in fewer words and you would also not have the repeating of the exact same word. You would have reunite here and unite here. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was primarily to unite the nation as quickly as possible and to restore Southern representation in government with little consequences to the South. Okay, let's see about that part down there. I'm just going to type in the South. Yes, the South should be capital. And sorry about that, that should be in red because it's an actual grammar mistake. With little consequences to the South. Lincoln believed the Confederate States should be treated as if they had never actually left the Union. Grammar. Capitalization. He would forgive the South if 10% of voters swore to uphold and abide by the Constitution. He felt there was no need for a more harsh, we could call that harsher, punishment. The congressional, another thing is we've got a repeating of he and he right here. So maybe we could rearrange those sentences so we don't have a repeating of the same sentence, same words and same structure. The Congressional Reconstruction Plan was more so the Northerners who opposed Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction because they won. So that's a little bit confusing. I think what it means to be was more for the Northerners. The Congressional Reconstruction Plan was more for the Northerners who opposed Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction because they wanted harsh punishment for the South. Let's actually change this. We'll just make it more severe. So that way we're not repeating harsh and harsh. Lincoln's plan had offered official forgiveness to nearly all Confederates who swore allegiance to the nation. So I'm curious about this choice right here, had offered. So when we use had done something, we want to usually say that that action was interrupted by something else. If we want to talk about an action in the past that is just over and done with, then we should just use the simple regular past tense. So Lincoln's plan offered official forgiveness to nearly all Confederates who swore allegiance to the nation. If we don't really need that had in there, let's just use the regular past. Lincoln's plan offered. Too simple in that they needed to be stricter. Their major goal was to gain voting rights for newly freed slaves and didn't want the South to re-enter the Union unless the 14th Amendment was ratified, which granted citizenship to black Americans. So if we want to use this part right here, which granted citizenship to black Americans, let's go ahead and put that right after the 14th Amendment. So we could use that we could just put a comma here, unless the 14th Amendment, comma, which granted citizenship to black Americans, comma, was ratified. Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which split the southern states into 5 military districts, each under the control of a northern general whose responsibility was to protect life and property. We can get rid of that it. Congress also voted to impeach Johnson in 1868. He avoided impeachment. So here we have 2 complete sentences. Again, here's a group of words that's complete. Congress voted to impeach Johnson, and then another group starting here, he avoided impeachment, and there's nothing in the middle to join them. So let's think about what ought to go there. We could just put a semicolon there, and that would just join them. That would be grammatically fine. But I'm curious about what's the relationship between this group of words, Congress also voted to impeach Johnson, and this group, he avoided impeachment. It seems like there's a contrast here, because they voted to get rid of him, but he didn't get rid of he managed to avoid that. So let's use a word, let's use the word but here, because there's a contrast between these two groups of words. But he avoided impeachment. Again, let's also put a comma here because these are different facts. But he avoided impeachment, and Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. This is starting to get into the ideas now. It's not really style or grammar. So I'm going to actually use the color green for that. And that's just a bit confusing. How did he avoid impeachment? So they didn't get rid of him, but then Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. So yeah, just a little, could be cleared up a little bit. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was enacted to guarantee equal rights for newly freed African Americans. The 13th Amendment was passed in order to abolish slavery. So when you write this, abolish slavery specifically stating, the specifically stating, because it comes right after slavery, the way you wrote it is describing slavery. Slavery specifically stating. But we don't want this thing right here to describe slavery. We want this thing to describe the amendment. So it should connect to that thing. So let's just say the 13th Amendment was passed in order to abolish slavery. Period. It specifically stated and we'll fix that too. So we need a colon there. Slavery nor involuntary, okay. The 14th Amendment was passed by Congress on June. Okay. So something interesting, I've just now noticed that up here you were writing these as numbers, and here you wrote it all out. So I think that the rule on that is that if something is larger than 10, then we are supposed to write it out. Let me check. So I just Googled when to write out numbers. And the rule is spell out single-digit whole numbers. So again, single-digit whole numbers. So if you say 5, we write 5. I'm sorry, I just completely got it backwards. If it's a single-digit number, we spell it out. But if it's not a single-digit whole number, then we write it out. 10. So it looks like all the things we're talking about, 13th, 14th, 15th, all fall into this category. So there's no reason to write this as 14th. We should just write it in the same way that we were doing earlier. 14th Amendment was passed by Congress on June 13th, 1866, granting African Americans citizenship. Citizenship making them equal to white Americans. So, again, it's confusing that making follows right after citizenship like that. The comma here. Comma here. Granting African Americans citizenship, which made them equal to white Americans. And again, we've got a problem here. We've got a comma here, and as we talked about earlier, the comma cannot connect two complete sentences. So is this complete? The 14th Amendment was passed. It is complete. And this one says, the amendment states, etc. So complete and complete And that means we cannot connect them with just a comma. Let's put a semicolon there. So, we need a period here, new sentence. This amendment, So I'm interested in that you use the present tense here. This amendment gives African Americans the right to vote. It is kind of confusing because earlier you were using the present tense too up here. The reason we use the present tense up here is that the 15th Amendment still continues to state to this day. It says the same thing that it said then. So it's appropriate to use the present tense. But I think for this one, I think it would be better to use the past. Because that's an action that the amendment did at a certain point in the past. So it makes more sense to say this amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. Really, both of them are okay. But when you say gives, you really are emphasizing that the amendment continues to do that thing up to this day. So if you want to do that, then gives is fine. But if you want to talk about it in the past and what it did at that moment in 1866, then I think gave is a better choice. So again, I'm going to actually call that blue because it's a style error. It's not really a grammar error. So this is perfectly fine to say allowed for. It's not a grammar error. But allowed for makes it seem like the Southern economy wanted to change and they just couldn't change or something like that. I think that the Reconstruction period, what if we just said it changed the Southern economy? Maybe there's a reason that you really want to use allowed for, and I'm just wrong about this. But I think if we could make it simpler to say the Reconstruction period changed the Southern economy from agricultural to a more industrialized economy. From a more agricultural, to a more industrialized economy. Prior to the Civil War, the Southern economy was primarily based on cotton and tobacco products farmed on plantations. The end of the Civil War left the South in a state of devastation, roads, buildings. So just saying the sentence, I can tell just saying it aloud that it's a run-on. The end of the Civil War left the South in a state of devastation, roads, buildings. So let's put a colon there. Left the South in a state of devastation. And then you're about to describe what that devastation was like, so it's a perfect place to put in a colon right there. Roads, buildings, bridges, plantations. Remember, we need a comma after all the items in the list except for the last item. Roads, buildings, bridges, plantations, and even the government system. Okay, this verb was seems like it's going to all of this stuff. All of that was destroyed. And there's more than one thing here. Several things, so we need to say were. Rebuilding the torn land became known as the Reconstruction period. So, rebuilding is not a period, but you could say the time of rebuilding the war-torn land, became known as the Reconstruction period. The war destroyed everything across the South. Workers were needed to help rebuild the infrastructure of the South, as opposed to working on plantations. Former plantation owners and small farmers used cheap labor to farm land. So it's a little confusing because you were talking about cheap labor and then you jump straight into the sharecropping system. And I know that those two things go along together, but it's always a good idea just to indicate that. So you could have said something like, this form of cheap labor was called the sharecropping system, period. That was a way in which black families, just make sure that there's always a clear link from one sentence to the next. Black families, usually former slaves, would rent small plots of land in return for a portion of their crop to be given to the land. A portion of their crop, which was given to the landowner at the end of each year. Industry was brought to the New South. Crops like, there's a comma splice here. Let's use a comma and we can put a conjunction word, and. And crops like cotton and tobacco were no longer exported for processing. Instead, factories for manufacturing textiles and steel were built, which provided work for Southern laborers. This caused them to shift in the economy from agricultural to industrial. These changes that were brought forth as a result call this the changes brought forth as a result of the Reconstruction era eventually helped unite the country. The amendments are still in effect today, granting everyone. I'm going to put a dash here, granting everyone, not only African Americans, another dash, the right to freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. Although attempts have been made recently to make it more difficult for some segments of the population to vote. Although attempts have been made, we need a comma here. The 15th Amendment still stands. The devastation of the Southern economy after the Civil War called for, should be an expansion of industrial growth, changing the economy from again, this is a style thing. We've repeated this a lot, that phrase. You see it up here too. And it was earlier too, so maybe find a different way to phrase that. Though Lincoln didn't live to see his plans come to fruition, he would have been pleased with the outcome of the Reconstruction era because it closely mirrored his vision for the nation. I really like that last line, closely mirrored his vision for the nation. It's nice.